"Excuse me, have you seen Donna Whitfield, my mother? Does she still come around here? You're Donna's son. You should follow me, son. Mom, what are you doing in here? Hush now, sweetheart. Lower your voice. The girls are still asleep." "What girls, Mom? What happened to the house? Promise me you won't say anything to Reverend Paul." "Not yet." Matthew Whitfield stepped off his transatlantic flight in Charleston, expecting to bury his uncle and quietly slip back to Germany within the week. Instead, a gas station attendant on Route 17 leaned across the counter, dropped his voice to almost a whisper, and told him that if he wanted to find his mother, he should try Mercy Chapel on Pine Hollow Road after dark. 2 hours later, Matthew pushed open the heavy oak doors of the church he had grown up inside, and found his 68-year-old mother curled beneath a thin wool blanket on the very back pew, a Bible folded into a pillow under her head. The little white house he had paid the mortgage on for 6 years was unlit and locked. The bank account Reverend Paul had set up to receive his monthly transfers showed deposits going in, but somehow none of them seemed to be reaching her. And when Matthew gently shook her shoulder and whispered her name, Donna's first words weren't joy or surprise. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and whispered, please don't speak to Paul about this until I tell you it's safe." The fear in her eyes hit him harder than the long flight, harder than the funeral notice, harder than anything he'd felt in years. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional dramas where every quiet detail hides a bigger secret, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. And before we begin, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. 6 years earlier, Matthew had left this small coastal town believing he was finally building a life that could protect the people he loved. At 43, Matthew Whitfield had become something his hometown could barely picture. He was a senior maritime lawyer in Hamburg, Germany, specializing in shipping fraud, cargo disputes, and the kind of complicated international cases that paid extraordinarily well and demanded almost everything in return. Just 4 months earlier, he had closed the biggest settlement of his career, a case involving falsified bills of lading across 3 continents. The partners at his firm had thrown him a dinner overlooking the Elbe River. His colleagues had toasted his name. A German legal magazine had called him one of the sharpest fraud minds in the North Sea trade, but sitting on the long flight home, none of that occupied Matthew's mind. He was thinking about his mother. Donna Whitfield had spent her entire life within 30 miles of the Atlantic. She had worked as a school nurse for almost 40 years, retired without fanfare, and spent her Sundays in the second pew of Mercy Chapel, exactly where her own mother used to sit. She had never once complained about money, never once asked Matthew to send more, never once suggested anything was wrong. Matthew called every Sunday. He wired support through Reverend Paul's church-managed assistance fund every single month for 6 years without missing once. Reverend Paul Hodges had been his father's closest friend for 40 years. The Reverend had baptized Matthew. He had carried Matthew's father's casket. He had stood beside Donna the day the cancer diagnosis came back clean. If there was one human being on earth Matthew trusted with his mother's well-being besides himself, it was Paul. Yet here she was, asleep on a pew, while a house Matthew had paid for sat dark and locked half a mile away. Matthew lowered himself onto the worn cushion beside her, careful not to make the wood creak. The sanctuary smelled of old hymnals and lemon polish and something else, something Matthew couldn't quite place. Coffee maybe, or fear. From somewhere deeper in the building behind the chancel he heard a sound he hadn't expected. A baby, crying softly. Then a young woman's voice hushing it. And then footsteps, quick and careful, moving away. Donna's eyes opened. She saw him. She didn't smile. For a long moment neither of them moved. Donna sat up slowly, pulling the wool blanket around her shoulders the way someone does when they've been cold for a very long time. Matthew studied her face in the dim light spilling from the single bulb above the choir loft. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not frail exactly. Smaller in the way people get when they've been making themselves take up less space on purpose. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple braid. Her hands, when she finally reached for his, felt thinner than they should have. You weren't supposed to come until Thursday, she whispered. Uncle Ray's funeral was moved up, Matthew said. They sent a notice. I caught the first flight. She nodded slowly, as if processing information from very far away. Then her eyes moved past him toward the doors, toward the road, toward something Matthew couldn't see. The same nervous glance he would later recognize on the faces of nearly everyone in this town. How long can you stay? She asked. Mom, what's happening here? How long, Matthew? As long as it takes. Something in her shoulders released, just slightly. She squeezed his hand once and then let it go. Then we'll talk in the morning. Not here, not tonight. There's a girl in the parsonage kitchen who hasn't slept in 3 days. If she hears voices, she'll think he found her. Who? Not tonight. Donna's voice was gentle, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. It was the voice she had used when he was 8 years old and trying to climb the magnolia tree in the rain. The voice that ended conversations. Matthew didn't argue. He drove back to the small inn off Main Street and lay awake on a creaking bed staring at the ceiling fan until the first gray light came through the curtains. He kept thinking about the phrase she had used. He found her. He kept thinking about the dark house on Pine Hollow Road. He kept thinking about 6 years of bank transfers. He pulled out his phone at 2 in the morning and scrolled back through his transaction history. Every one of them was there. The first of every month. The same routing number Reverend Paul had given him in 2019. 6 years, 72 deposits, every single one marked confirmed. He fell asleep around 4. He dreamed of cargo manifests. In the morning he drove back to Mercy Chapel. The parking lot held 3 cars now, one of them a battered Toyota with a child's car seat in the back and a North Carolina plate. Matthew didn't go inside. He walked around the side of the building to the small parsonage that sat behind the sanctuary, the white clapboard house where Reverend Paul had lived for 31 years. He raised his hand to knock. He didn't get the chance. The door opened. Reverend Paul stood there in a flannel shirt and pressed khakis, a coffee mug in one hand. He had aged. That was Matthew's first thought. The man who had given his father's eulogy looked 20 years older than he should have. There were dark hollows beneath his eyes. His shoulders sagged in a way Matthew had never seen on the broad-shouldered farmer-turned-pastor who used to lift him onto his shoulders during church picnics. Matthew, Paul said. His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. Son, your mother told me you came in last night. Reverend. The 2 men stood in the doorway. Paul didn't move to embrace him. That alone was strange. 40 years of friendship with Matthew's father, 6 years of caring for Donna, and Paul didn't open his arms. He simply stood there gripping the coffee mug so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Come in, Paul said finally. Please, come in. The parsonage kitchen was clean in the desperate way of a man who lives alone and has nothing to do with his hands. The countertops gleamed. The dish rack held 1 plate, 1 mug, 1 fork. Paul gestured toward a chair at the small breakfast table. Matthew sat. Paul didn't. I imagine you have questions, Paul said. He set the mug down. His hand was shaking. I have a lot of them, Matthew said quietly. I'd like to start with the easy one. Where has the money been going, Paul? The Reverend closed his eyes. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Matthew, son, I need you to understand something before I answer that. Paul lowered himself into the chair across from Matthew. He moved like a man easing into cold water. The morning light through the kitchen window caught the side of his face, and Matthew saw something there he hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, something closer to grief. The kind of grief a man carries when he's been mourning his own integrity for a very long time. Your money reached this church, Paul said carefully. Every dollar, every month. I can show you the deposit records. They came in through the assistance fund account exactly as we set up in 2019. Then, why was my mother sleeping on a pew last night, Paul? The Reverend flinched. He picked up the coffee mug again, more to have something to hold than to drink. Your mother sleeps on that pew by her own choice, not because she has nowhere else to go. The house is still hers. The bills are paid. The lights work. She sleeps on the pew because she's given the house to other people who need it more. Matthew sat very still. Explain. I think she should explain that part, Paul said. It's her story. I won't take it from her. But Matthew, I need to tell you something else before you talk to her, and I need to tell you now before I lose the nerve. He set the mug down. He pressed both palms flat against the table. The money you sent reached the church account, but it didn't always reach your mother, not the way it should have, not all of it, for a long time now. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the parsonage a clock ticked. How long is a long time? Almost 4 years. Matthew didn't move. He had learned in 20 years of fraud work that the worst moment in any interview was the moment you discovered the witness had been lying to you by omission for years. The trick was not to react. The trick was to let the silence do the work. He had used that silence on shipping executives and dock supervisors and falsifying captains. He had never expected to use it on a man who had baptized him. Paul broke first. He always would have. He was not built for this. His name is Larry Boudreau, Paul said. He's been the lay treasurer of Mercy Chapel for 11 years. Before that, he ran a small accounting practice out of Georgetown. He volunteered for the position. The vestry was grateful. Nobody else wanted the job. He's good with numbers, Matthew. He's very, very good with numbers. He's been very, very good at hiding what he's been doing with them. How much, Paul? I don't know the exact figure. I'm afraid to know. Hundreds of thousands across the whole congregation's accounts. Building fund, missions fund, assistance fund, memorial gifts. He moves it through sub-accounts I don't have the password for. I've tried. God help me, I've tried. Matthew's voice stayed level. Then why is he still the treasurer? Paul looked down at his hands. When he finally answered, his voice had gone almost inaudible. Because 3 years ago he came to my office with a folder. There were photographs in that folder. Of a woman who used to teach Sunday school here. A woman I loved very much, Matthew, before your father got sick and after your mother lost her sister, when everyone in this town was grieving and I was grieving too, and I made a choice I have regretted every single day since. The woman is gone now. She moved to Atlanta 2 years ago. She's married. She has a life. If those photographs surface, it doesn't hurt me anymore. It hurts her. Her husband doesn't know. Her children don't know. So he's been blackmailing you. Yes. With photographs of an affair from years ago. Yes. And in exchange, you've looked the other way while he steals from the church. I haven't looked the other way. Paul's voice cracked. I've been making up the difference out of my own salary, wherever I could, for your mother especially. I have been driving groceries to her house 3 times a week for 4 years. I have been paying her power bill out of my own checking account. I have been doing what I could in the ways I could, and I have hated myself for not doing more. Matthew didn't speak for a long time. He looked at the older man across the table and tried to reconcile the image of the broad-shouldered pastor who had taught him to bait a hook with the trembling figure now staring at his own hands. People like to imagine corruption as a single dramatic decision. A bribe accepted. A line crossed. Real life was almost never that clean. Real life was 1,000 small surrenders, each one slightly worse than the last, until one day a man woke up and discovered he had built a prison around himself out of his own choices. Why didn't you tell me? Matthew asked finally. His voice was quieter than he intended. For years, Paul, I called every Sunday. Because every time I picked up the phone, I told myself 1 more month and I'd have it figured out. 1 more month and I'd find a way to expose him without hurting her. 1 more month and I'd find the courage. Paul's eyes were wet now, but he didn't wipe them. And every month I didn't, and every month your mother's situation got a little worse. And every month I told myself the same lie. Matthew stood up. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the small garden behind the parsonage. Tomato plants on stakes. A bird feeder. Ordinary things. He breathed slowly the way he did before a deposition. Where is Larry now? He lives out on County Road 41, the white house with the green shutters. He's there most mornings until he comes in to do the deposits on Wednesdays and Fridays. And the records. Most of them are in the office filing cabinet behind the sanctuary. The electronic files are on a laptop he keeps in his own house. He brings it in when he needs it. He doesn't trust the church Wi-Fi. Of course he doesn't. Matthew turned back from the window. Paul, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to handle this. I'm going to handle it the right way, which means slowly and with documentation, and I need you not to confront him, not to warn him, not to do anything that would make him destroy records or run. Can you do that for me? Yes. And Paul, when this is over, you're going to retire. Not because I'm telling you to, because you already know you need to." The older man closed his eyes. He nodded once. It was the smallest nod Matthew had ever seen. It also looked like the most honest thing Paul had done in years. Matthew left the parsonage and walked back across the gravel lot to the church. The Toyota with the North Carolina plate was gone. A different car sat there now, an old gray sedan with a "Help Me Help You" bumper sticker peeling at one corner. Inside the sanctuary, the back pew was empty. The wool blanket had been folded neatly and tucked beneath a hymnal. From the fellowship hall in the basement, Matthew could hear voices, women's voices, and the unmistakable sound of a coffee pot finishing its cycle. He went down the narrow staircase. He paused at the bottom. The fellowship hall was a small, low-ceilinged room with cinder block walls painted cream and a long table in the middle. 3 women sat at it. One of them was very young, maybe 20, with a sleeping infant against her shoulder and a bruise yellowing along her jawline. One of them was older, mid-30s, watchful, the kind of watchful that came from years of reading exits in every room. And one of them was Donna Whitfield, pouring coffee from a battered pot into mismatched mugs and saying something soft that made the youngest woman smile for the first time in what looked like a long while. Donna saw him in the doorway. She didn't startle. She simply set the coffee pot down and said, "Matthew, come sit, there's plenty." He came in. He sat. The older woman studied him for a long, careful moment and then seemed to decide he was safe. The younger one didn't look up. Donna slid a mug across the table to him, and then, as if she had been waiting for permission to begin, she began. "You wanted to know what happened to the house," she said. "I'm going to tell you. But I need you to listen all the way through before you say anything." Matthew wrapped both hands around the mug. "I'm listening." Donna sat down across from him. She tucked a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear. The young woman with the baby shifted in her chair, and the older woman reached over and steadied the infant's head with the unconscious tenderness of someone who had once been that young woman herself. "4 years ago," Donna began, "a girl came to the church on a Tuesday night. She was 19 years old. She had driven down from Marion County with a busted lip and $42 and a child she was trying to keep alive. The shelter up there had closed 6 months earlier. The county lost its grant. There was nowhere for her to go. She had heard from a cousin that Mercy Chapel kept its doors open at night, so she came." Matthew didn't speak. Donna's voice had taken on the steady rhythm she used to use when reading aloud, the voice that had carried him through every illness of his childhood. "Reverend Paul was out of town that night. It was just me. I had stayed late to organize the choir robes for Sunday. I found her sitting in the back pew shaking. I asked her what she needed. She said she needed a place where her husband wouldn't think to look. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then I drove her to the house, our house, your father's house. I gave her your old room. I told her she could stay as long as she needed, and that the only rule was she had to tell me if she felt safe enough to call her mother in the morning. She stayed 11 days, Donna said. Then her sister came down from Charlotte and took her home. 2 weeks later another one came. A different girl, different county, same story, then a third. After the first year I stopped being surprised. After the second year I stopped trying to count." Matthew's coffee had gone cold in his hands. "Mom, let me finish." She held up one finger. The older woman across the table almost smiled. It was the same finger Donna had used on 3 generations of disobedient 8-year-olds at the elementary school clinic, and it still worked. "The shelter network in this part of the state has been collapsing for years, Matthew. Funding cuts, building condemnations, one county after another. Women have nowhere to go and the men who hurt them know it. So they look harder. They search the obvious places harder. They watch the parking lots of the obvious places. What they don't watch is a 68-year-old widow's house on a quiet road behind a church. They don't watch a back pew on a Tuesday night. You've been running an underground shelter out of our home. I have been letting frightened women sleep somewhere their husbands wouldn't think to look. I don't run anything. I don't have a license. I don't have insurance. I don't have a board. I have a house and a pew and a coffee pot and the phone numbers of 3 deputies I trust and 1 judge in Georgetown who knows what I'm doing and pretends not to." The young woman with the baby looked up for the first time. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "She saved my life," she said quietly. "2 nights ago. She drove out at midnight to a Waffle House parking lot and brought me here." Donna reached across the table and patted the young woman's hand. "Hush, sweetheart. He doesn't need that part right now." But Matthew did need it. He needed it badly, because something in his chest had been tightening since he walked down those stairs, and now it cracked open. For 6 years he had pictured his mother growing old in a quiet house, doing crosswords, going to choir practice, slowly diminishing the way he had assumed older women diminished. He had pictured her needing him. He had built a career around being able to send money to a woman who needed it. And the truth, sitting across from him in a cinderblock fellowship hall, was that his mother had never diminished a single day in her entire life. She had been doing the most important work she had ever done, and she had been doing it alone, and she had been doing it on top of being quietly robbed by a man none of them had yet named at this table. "Mom," Matthew said, "when did you last sleep in your own bed?" "Tuesday a week ago," she said. "Maybe Wednesday." Matthew set the coffee mug down very carefully because his hands had begun to shake and he didn't trust them. He looked at his mother across the long table, and for a moment he could see her at every age she had ever been. 26 and pregnant, kneeling in the garden behind the Pine Hollow house. 40 and standing at his father's bedside in the oncology ward. 62 and waving from the porch the morning he left for Germany. And now this. 68 years old, sleeping on a wooden pew while a man down the road quietly emptied the account that was supposed to be keeping her warm. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something about the money." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." So he told her. He told her about the 72 transfers, about Paul's confession in the parsonage kitchen, about Larry Boudreau and the photographs, and 4 years of quiet theft. He watched his mother's face as he spoke. He had expected anger. He had expected tears. What he saw instead was something stranger and more terrible. She looked, for one long moment, profoundly tired. As if a suspicion she had been carrying alone for a very long time had finally been confirmed by someone else, and the confirmation didn't lighten the weight so much as make it real. "I knew something wasn't right," she said quietly. "I didn't know what. Why didn't you call me? Because every time I thought about calling you, I thought about what you'd do. You'd come home. You'd tear it open. And I was afraid of what that would mean for Paul." She looked down at her own hands. "Your father loved Paul, Matthew. He stood at his funeral and he wept. I couldn't be the one who destroyed him, even if part of me knew he was already destroying himself." The older woman across the table stood up quietly and gathered the empty mugs. She tilted her head toward the young mother, and the two of them slipped out of the fellowship hall without a word, leaving Matthew and Donna alone with the long table between them and 4 years of unspoken things between them too. "Mom," Matthew said, "I'm going to fix this. All of it. The money, the records, Larry, and the shelter, because what you've been doing here is too important to keep doing the way you've been doing it. You're going to lose the house one of these nights. You know that? Some man is going to follow his wife down a back road and find your front porch, and you're going to be standing there in your bathrobe with a coffee pot and a phone, and that is not going to end the way you want it to end." She didn't argue. She had been waiting, he realized, to hear someone say it out loud, for a long time perhaps. "What do you need?" she asked. 2 days. Give me 2 days with the church's books and access to Paul's office. Don't say anything to Larry. Don't change your routine. If he comes in for the Wednesday deposit, smile at him the way you always do. And after 2 days, he will not be the treasurer of this church anymore. And then we're going to sit down with a real lawyer in Charleston, and we're going to talk about what it looks like to do this work the right way, with a registered nonprofit, with insurance, with a real building, with locks and protocols and a board that actually knows what it's doing." Donna's eyes filled. She didn't let the tears fall. She nodded once slowly and reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. Her fingers were thin and warm, and they trembled very slightly. "You were always going to be the one who came home and did this," she said. "I just didn't know it would take you this long." Matthew swallowed hard. He had no answer for that. He had been telling himself for 6 years that he was building something his family could lean on. The truth was that the leaning had been going the other way the entire time, and he had been too far away to feel it. He squeezed her hands, then he stood up. "I'm going to go see Paul," he said. "I need keys to the office, and then I need to make some calls." Donna nodded. "Matthew, one more thing." She looked up at him from the long table. "When you talk to Larry, don't do it alone." Matthew spent the rest of that day inside the church office. Paul had unlocked the filing cabinet and the small interior door that led to the records room and had then, at Matthew's instruction, gone home to the parsonage and stayed there. The fewer people who saw the lights on in the church office, the better. Matthew worked at the desk under a single banker's lamp. He had brought his laptop from the inn. He had brought a yellow legal pad. He had brought 20 years of pattern recognition from the kind of cases that destroyed shipping companies. And now, he turned all of it on the ledger books of a small white chapel in coastal South Carolina. By midnight, he had found the first thread. It was in the building fund account. A reimbursement to Larry Boudreaux dated March of the previous year for materials at a local hardware store. The amount was $487. The receipt attached was for $162. The difference of $325 had been quietly pocketed and the discrepancy buried under a column labeled miscellaneous. It was a small theft. It was also unmistakable, and once Matthew knew what the pattern looked like, he saw it everywhere. Reimbursements that didn't match receipts. Vendor payments to companies with names just slightly different from real local businesses. Memorial gift entries credited to the general fund, and then withdrawn the following week as administrative fees. The assistance fund showed Matthew's monthly transfers arriving like clockwork, and showed roughly 40% of each one being moved within 72 hours to a subaccount labeled, almost insultingly, Outreach Reserve. By 2 in the morning, Matthew had a spreadsheet. By 4, he had a timeline. By 6, when the first gray light came through the office window, he had a number. The number was not a guess. It was conservative. It was the smallest possible figure that the documentation would support in front of a judge. The number was $147,000. He sat back in the desk chair and rubbed his eyes. He thought about Larry Boudreaux out on County Road 41 in the white house with the green shutters, asleep now, unaware that a maritime fraud lawyer with 20 years of pattern work had just spent 11 hours dismantling him. Matthew felt no satisfaction. He felt the particular flatness that always came at the end of a long audit, the recognition that the numbers told a story, but the story didn't bring anything back. The money was mostly gone. The years were entirely gone. The most he could do now was stop the bleeding and make the consequences real. He slept for 3 hours on the small couch in the office. He woke up when his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a Charleston number he had called the previous afternoon. A woman named Alina Fitch, an attorney specializing in nonprofit formation and elder financial protection. She had agreed to drive up that morning. She would be in town by 10. Matthew called Donna next. He told her to stay at the house. He told her to lock the doors. He told her that today was the day and that she should not come to the church until he called her back. He called Paul third. He told him to be in the office at 11. He called the Georgetown County Sheriff's white-collar investigator fourth, a detective named Marisol Reeves whose name Alina had given him. He had spoken to her briefly the previous afternoon. He told her now that he had the documentation she had asked for and that he would be presenting it formally at noon. Then he made coffee in the small church kitchen and waited. Alina Fitch arrived at 10 minutes past 10 in a sensible navy suit with a leather briefcase and the unhurried calm of a woman who had spent 30 years doing exactly this work. She looked at Matthew's spreadsheet for 9 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up and said, "Mr. Whitfield, this is the cleanest forensic summary I have ever been handed by a civilian. Are you sure you're a maritime lawyer?" "Fraud is fraud," Matthew said. "The ships just have nicer names than Larry." Alina smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, but it was real. "Then let's go ruin his morning," she said. Paul arrived at 11. He looked as though he had not slept at all, which Matthew suspected was true. He sat in the chair Alina pointed him to. He signed the documents she put in front of him. He did not argue with any of them. At 11:45, Detective Marisol Reeves arrived in an unmarked sedan with a younger deputy beside her. She was a small, compact woman in her early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had spent a long career watching people try to lie to her. She accepted a cup of coffee. She accepted the binder Matthew had prepared for her. She read the executive summary on the first page in silence. She turned 3 pages. She closed the binder. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "where would you like to do this?" "He comes in for the Wednesday deposit at 1 o'clock, Matthew said. "He'll come through the side door of the church and into this office. He'll set the deposit bag on this desk. He'll log into his laptop and reconcile the morning's entries. He does this every Wednesday for about 40 minutes. That's when I'd like you to come in. And you'll be where? I'll be at this desk. Reverend Paul will be in the corner chair. Miss Fitch will be in the doorway behind me. We'd like Larry to understand before anything else happens that the room is not on his side." Reeves looked at him for a long moment. "You've done this before." "Not in a church," Matthew said. She almost smiled. "Fair enough." At 12:58, the gravel crunched in the side lot. A door slammed. Heavy footsteps approached. The side door opened and Larry Boudreau stepped into the office with the deposit bag slung over one shoulder and a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee in his free hand. He was a thick man in his early 60s with a florid face and the easy smile of someone who had spent decades being trusted by people who shouldn't have trusted him. He stopped when he saw Matthew at the desk. "Well, hello there," Larry said. The smile arrived a half-second too late. "Donna's boy, heard you were back in town, sorry about your Uncle Ray." "Thank you, Larry, have a seat." Larry didn't sit. His eyes flicked to Paul in the corner, they flicked to Alina in the doorway, they flicked to the binder in front of Matthew. The florid color in his cheeks deepened a single shade. "What's this about?" "Sit down, Larry." He sat. The styrofoam cup made a small wet sound when he set it on the desk. Matthew opened the binder. He turned it around so Larry could see the first page. He didn't say anything. He simply let Larry's eyes move down the page, line by line, and watched the moment in which a man understood he had been seen all the way through. "Now wait a minute," Larry said. His voice had gone thinner. "Now you wait a minute, son. There's a context to all of this that you don't understand. Reverend Paul and I have been managing these funds together for over a decade, and there are reasons for the way certain accounts have been structured that go back to decisions made long before you were sending any money to this congregation." "Larry," Paul said quietly from the corner. It was the first time he had spoken. "Stop. Paul, you stay out of this." "No," Paul said. The word was small, but it had something underneath it that hadn't been there in years. "No, Larry. I'm not staying out of this anymore. I should have spoken up 3 years ago. I should have spoken up the day you put that folder on my desk. I didn't, and that is on me, and I will live with it. But I am done staying out of things." Larry's mouth opened and closed. He looked from Paul to Matthew to Alina to the binder on the desk. And Matthew watched, with the same flat clinical attention he had brought to a dozen depositions, as the man began to understand that the photographs in the folder were no longer leverage. They were simply photographs of a sad old mistake by a man who was about to confess to it himself in front of a detective who, at that moment, opened the office door from the hallway and stepped inside with her deputy behind her. "Mr. Boudreau," Detective Reeves said pleasantly. "I'm Marisol Reeves with the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office. I wonder if you'd be willing to step outside with me for a conversation." Larry looked at the deposit bag on the desk. He looked at his styrofoam cup. He looked at his own hands. Then he stood up slowly and he followed her out of the office without another word, and the side door closed behind them and the room was very quiet. The arrest itself was nothing dramatic. There were no handcuffs in the side lot, no shouting, no neighbors gathering. Detective Reeves walked Larry to her sedan, opened the passenger door, and drove him to the county building in Georgetown for what she called a preliminary interview. The deputy stayed behind to collect the laptop from Larry's house, with a warrant that Alina had quietly arranged that morning. Paul sat in the corner chair for a long time after they left, staring at the floor. Alina closed the binder with a soft snap and looked at Matthew. "You did good work," she said. Now comes the long part. The long part took most of the next 4 months. There were interviews with the diocesan office and with the church's small vestry, most of whom had no idea what had been happening under their own roof, and reacted with the specific grief of people who realized they had been failing their own community by not paying closer attention. There were forensic accountants who confirmed Matthew's number and then revised it upward. The final figure was $183,000 over 11 years, not just 4. Larry had been quietly stealing from Mercy Chapel since long before Matthew had ever started sending support. The 4 years of accelerated theft had simply been the chapter in which a vulnerable elderly woman became part of the cost. Larry pleaded out before the case ever went to trial. He was 63 years old. His attorney negotiated a sentence that included restitution from the sale of his house and his late wife's small inheritance, 3 years in a state facility, and a permanent bar from any financial fiduciary role for the rest of his life. It was not as much time as some people in town wanted. It was more than Larry had been planning for. The photographs were never released. Alina had quietly handled that piece. The woman in Atlanta never knew her name had come up in a South Carolina law office. Matthew thought that was probably the closest thing to grace the whole story would ever produce. Paul announced his retirement from the pulpit on a Sunday in late March. He did it without drama. He stood in front of the congregation and he told them plainly that he had failed them in ways they didn't yet fully understand, and that the vestry would be sharing more in the weeks to come, and that he was sorry. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply said he was sorry, and he stepped down from the pulpit, and he sat in the second pew next to Donna for the rest of the service. Matthew watched from 3 rows back. He thought his father would have approved of the way Paul did it. He thought his father would have sat in that pew too. The shelter took longer. Alina walked Donna through the nonprofit formation process step by step, and Matthew flew back from Hamburg twice during the spring to sign documents and meet with the board they assembled. They called it the Pine Hollow House, after the road. They formalized what Donna had been doing informally for 4 years. They added a part-time social worker funded out of a small grant Alina helped them apply for. They added a real intake protocol, a real safety plan, a real relationship with the county sheriff's office that Detective Reeves helped broker. The judge in Georgetown, who had been quietly looking the other way for years, came to the first board meeting and brought a casserole. And Matthew, who had always told himself that what his mother needed was his money, discovered slowly across those 4 months that what she had actually needed was his presence. He took a leave from the Hamburg firm in May. He extended it in June. By July, he had begun, tentatively, to talk to the senior partners about a remote arrangement that would let him work the firm's North American cases from a small office he was setting up in Charleston. They agreed, with the easy generosity of people who had just been reminded that their best lawyer had finally remembered he was also a son. He bought a small house 10 minutes from Pine Hollow Road. Nothing extravagant. A 2-bedroom bungalow with a porch and a magnolia tree in the front yard. Donna picked out the curtains for the guest room. The first night Matthew slept in it, he dreamed of his father, not as a dying man but as he had been in the years before, standing on the dock at sunrise with a fishing rod, smiling at something Matthew couldn't quite see. The annex was finished in October. It was a small building behind the church, single-story, white clapboard to match the sanctuary, with 4 bedrooms and a common kitchen and a quiet office for the social worker. Matthew had funded it out of his own savings without making a public matter of it. The plaque beside the door was small. It read simply in memory of Charles Whitfield, who loved this church and loved his wife. Donna had chosen the words. She had cried for about 30 seconds when she saw the plaque hung for the first time, and then she had wiped her face and asked Matthew where they were going to put the donated washing machine, because they had 3 new intakes coming on Friday and the laundry had to work. The dedication service was held on a clear Sunday afternoon. The new pastor, a young woman named Reverend Tanya Brooks who had come down from Columbia, gave a short blessing. Paul stood in the back of the small crowd in a flannel shirt and pressed khakis. He looked, for the first time in years, like a man who was sleeping at night. Detective Reeves came in uniform and brought her teenage daughter. The judge from Georgetown came in jeans. A handful of women whose names would never appear on the public record stood at the edges of the gathering, some of them with their own children now, some of them just passing through on the way to lives they had built since. The young mother from the fellowship hall on Matthew's first morning back had come up from Florida for the day. Her baby was a toddler now, walking unsteadily across the grass, while she chased him with the particular tired joy of a woman who had been allowed to keep her child. She found Matthew after the service, and she didn't say much. She just took his hand in both of hers and held it for a moment and then walked away. Donna and Matthew sat together on the porch of the new annex after everyone left. The October light was long and gold, and the marsh grass behind the building had turned the color of old brass. Somewhere out on the water a bell buoy was ringing slowly. Donna had her shoes off. Matthew had a paper cup of weak punch in his hand. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally Donna said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "The first night you came home. You sat down next to me on that pew and you didn't say a word for almost a minute. I thought to myself, he knows something is wrong. He's going to make me tell him, and I was so tired, Matthew. I was so tired I almost wanted you to." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. "Because some part of me still believed that if I could just hold the whole thing up by myself a little longer, I wouldn't have to break your heart." He set the punch down on the porch rail. He reached over and took her hand the way she had taken his in the fellowship hall 4 months earlier. Her fingers were still thin. They were no longer trembling. "Mom," he said, "you couldn't have broken my heart. You only could have let me back into it." She squeezed his hand once. She didn't answer in words. The bell buoy rang again in the distance. A woman somewhere inside the annex laughed at something, and then a child laughed too, and the sound carried out through the open kitchen window and settled around them on the porch like something both ordinary and impossible. Matthew thought, sitting there, about the 6 years he had spent in Hamburg believing he was being a good son because his money arrived on the first of every month. He thought about all the things money could buy and all the things it could not. It could not sit on a pew at midnight. It could not drive to a Waffle House parking lot. It could not say a frightened woman's name out loud in a courtroom. It could not put a hand on an old friend's shoulder and tell him it was time to stop carrying a folder of photographs alone. Only a person could do those things. Only a person who was actually there. He was there now. He intended to stay. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell us about someone in your life you've been meaning to come home to. We read everyone.